Hello everybody and welcome back. This is yours truly, Benya 9400. This is the first part of a mini-series on important figures of the American Civil War who pretty much decided the ultimate outcome of the 4-year-long conflict that cost close to almost 700,000 lives on both sides of the divide. In this episode, I will be discussing the life and significance of General Ulysses S Grant, commander of the Union Army's input upon Republican President Abraham Lincoln's ambition to preserve the Union of these United States and abolish the evil practice of slavery, and Grant's eventual rise to the presidency. But before I get into all of that, I will touch on Grant's start in life, etc. How the son of a tanner and merchant went on to attend the West Point Military Academy in New York, command the Union Army, then serve as President of the United States before succumbing to throat cancer aged just 63. Ulysses S. Grant was born on the 27th of April, 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio, to Jesse Robert Grant, a tanner and merchant by profession, and Hannah Simpson Grant. Grant's ancestors arrived in the U.S. circa 1630 aboard the vessel named Mary and John, landed in what was then known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Military service seemed to be in Grant's DNA. His great-grandfather served in the French and Indian War, whereas his grandfather served with the colonials at Bunker Hill during the American Revolution. Passion for abolitionism was embedded within his DNA too, starting with his father Jesse. The young Grant originally wasn't destined for a life of military service. He was supposed to follow in the footsteps of his father Jesse, who was a tanner and a merchant. But following a letter his father drafted to Representative Thomas L. Hamer, that specifically requested that he nominate his son to the U.S. Military Academy, located in New York State at West Point, the young Grant's life changed considerably. It was looking like he had some direction and purpose in his life. However, despite the political differences between Grant's family and Representative Hamer, a Democrat, Hamer went ahead and nominated Grant to the noted academy, with Grant officially being accepted on the 1st of July, 1839, aged 17. Upon officially enrolling at the noted academy, Grant, but after a year on its grounds, he seriously reconsidered his original desire to leave the academy though, writing home saying, "I really like this place." Following progression within the academy, the young Grant quickly gained a reputation as a most proficient horseman, who'd go on to set a high jump record that would stand for 25 years. On the 30th of June, 1843, 4 years after enrolling at the famous academy, Grant graduated whilst ranked 21st out of 39 people in his class, earning himself the rank and title of Brevet Second Lieutenant. After graduation in 1844, Grant ventured to the Midwest, specifically Missouri, where he would visit with the Dent family, who were at the time prominent slaveholders. Grant would eventually become engaged to Julia Dent, who was the daughter of a prominent slave and plantation owner, Frederick Dent. Grant's father didn't disapprove of their marriage, but he actually strongly disapproved of his in-laws owning slaves. This is primarily why he didn't attend their wedding reception. Grant's first taste of actual military service came in 1846 when war broke out between the United States and Mexico following the annexation of the state of Texas. Here, Grant successfully managed to distinguish himself as a daring and competent soldier, ready to go take on any challenge thrown in front of him. However, following the conclusion of this conflict in 1848, Grant and his wife Julia relocated to Detroit, Michigan, but this didn't last though, as he was soon transferred to a barracks located in upstate New York, known as the Madison Barracks, which at the time was in dire need of supplies and repairs, as much as it was desolate. He would later return to Michigan in order to continue his responsibilities as a quartermaster. By 1854, Grant was 32 years old and had re-entered civilian life. But it would prove to be quite an uphill struggle rather from there, because Grant really struggled to support himself and his growing family financially. During this uncertain time in his life, a good number of Grant's business ventures failed, leaving him and his growing family in a rather difficult spot. All of this hardship would go on to last a grand total of 7 long years. Grant's father Jesse, in order to try and relieve Grant of some of the stresses in his life, offered him a place within the family's leather business located in Illinois. Both Grant and his wife Julia would go on to decline this offer. 2 years later, in 1856, the family moved on to Julia's father's farm, where they would construct a homestead that would be referred to as a hard scrabble, and from the perspective of Julia, an unattractive cabin. The young family had very little means, ranging from money, clothes, and furniture, but they didn't have more than enough food, though. The following year, during what is known as the Panic of 1857, Grant, along with millions of other farmers in the U.S. at the time, was heavily impacted by this financial collapse, which basically left him with no choice but to pawn off his gold watch in order to afford and purchase Christmas presents for his family. The following year, Grant rented out the Hardscrabble homestead, moving his family onto the 850-acre plantation owned by his wife Julia's family. Circumstances failed to improve for Grant because he contracted malaria, which basically meant any means to prevail financially ultimately failed. 3 years later, in the spring of 1861, civil war broke out in South Carolina, following a deadly assault upon the federal installation of Fort Sumter, presided over by General Robert Anderson of the Union Army, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. By that of the South Carolina Confederate rebel militia, numbering around 6,000 under the command of Confederate General P.T.G. Beauregard. General Anderson ultimately surrendered the fortification and withdrew to the northeast, where he was greeted with a hero's welcome. The primary reason for the outbreak of the Civil War in April of 1861 was the election of Republican President Abraham Lincoln, who ran on a platform of preserving the Union of the United States and abolishing the practice of slavery. From a Southern perspective, this was a direct attack upon their everyday way of life and means to make a living, so as a result, a steady flow of states, mostly located in the Deep South, started withdrawing from the Union in defiance. The first to do so was South Carolina, otherwise known as the Palmetto State. This chain of events eventually resulted in both sides of the divide calling for a massive mobilization of troops. Grant's first major battles of the Civil War were at Fort Henry in 1861 and Fort Donelson in 1862, both located in Tennessee, the volunteer state. Both campaigns resulted in victory for General Grant, but at great sacrifice, though. Exactly a year after the fall of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, that sparked the outbreak of the Civil War, it was now April of 1862, and Grant found himself back in command of the Union Army, this time at the Battle of Shiloh Church in the Confederate state of Tennessee, where he would be up against the man responsible for the deadly attack upon the federal installation of Fort Sumter, South Carolina, Commander P.G.T. Beauregard, and his counterpart Albert Sidney Johnson, who almost ended up getting killed during the bloody battle. This encounter in rural Tennessee resulted in victory for Grant, but at great sacrifice, though, something for which the Northern press reined in hard on him for. The overall amount of casualties from the battle totaled a staggering 23,746. The Vicksburg, Mississippi campaign of 1862-63 proved to be yet another vital strategic victory in the career of General Ulysses S Grant, because it essentially resulted in splitting the Confederate rebellion in two. The year was now 1864, and the fight has shifted north to the home state of the Confederacy, otherwise known as Virginia, in a campaign that would become to be known as the Overland Campaign, which involved a series of brutal battles spanning the course of 7 weeks from May through to June. The first of these 7 battles was at Cold Harbor, which Grant believed could easily break Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army's lines, which give him direct access to the main road leading to the Confederate capital city of Richmond, effectively ending the rebellion. This particular battle proved to greatly diminish Confederate morale, hence Grant's motivation to outright advance on Lee's position, which he considered vulnerable. The siege of Petersburg, Virginia, and the Battle of the Crater, as depicted in the 2003 movie called Melton, starring Oscar-winning actress Nicole Kidman, resulted in a 9-month-long siege where the city was defended by Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was also responsible for leading the South Carolina militia's attack upon the federal installation of Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor 3 years earlier, which essentially started the Civil War. Grant specifically instructed his regiments to follow the enemy to their death. However, he was eventually forced to transfer command of his army over to that of his compatriot, General Sheridan, who would eventually endure relentless attacks by Confederate General John S. Mosby's cavalry. In order to effectively strike at General Lee in a timely capacity, Grant had to use whatever resources were available to him because they were slowly depleting each passing day as the brutal conflict wore on. Grant would eventually approve a plan to blow up enemy trenches by filling a series of underground tunnels with many tons of gunpowder. The plan was eventually executed and resulted in the wiping out of an entire Confederate regiment in the process. However, on the other hand, a lot of Union soldiers lost their lives due to a terrible tactical decision that would involve them running head-on into the crater, leaving them vulnerable to Confederate sharpshooters. Most of the Union dead were black, recently freed slaves. Grant and Sheridan were victorious, but at great sacrifice, though. Despite Grant personally referring to his plan as a stupendous failure, the Pacific emphasis on the underground mining tactic. Following the conclusion of the Virginia campaign, the Union Army shifted their efforts and focus further south by capturing the strategic, important Confederate ports of Mobile Bay, Alabama, and Savannah, Georgia. The Georgia state capital of Atlanta would soon follow suit in what would go on to become one of the most storied campaigns of the war, especially given the nature of the brutality the Union Army's General William T. Sherman and his army committed against the city now. General Sherman had a reputation for being in favor of emancipating enslaved blacks. However, there was talk that he didn't favor blacks serving in regiments under his command, though. Accusations of this nature sometimes led to him being labeled a white supremacist or someone with those kind of sympathies. The year was now 1865, the final year of the brutal Bloody War. In April of that year, the commanders of both the Union and Confederate armies met in the front parlor of Appomattox Courthouse, located in Appomattox, Virginia, and Virginia being the birthplace of the Confederate Rebellion, etc. It was here General Lee officially surrendered his Confederate rebel army to Grant. At the end of the month, other Confederate regiments would follow suit in compliance with the official surrender document signed by Lee and crafted by Grant. The war officially ended on the 26th of May following the surrender of the Confederate regiment based out of Texas. However, 5 days after the surrender of the Confederacy, a popular stage actor who came from a prominent acting family and was known to be a Confederate sympathizer called John Wilkes Booth traveled to Washington, D.C. in order to attend a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, which would also be attended by President Abraham Lincoln and his wife, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, along with Union General Major Rathbone and his wife. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater through a side door, and since he was such a well-known personality in the industry, nobody stopped to ask him why and what he was doing there, so he strolled in, filled with murderous, revengeful rage. Wilkes Booth was an ardent Confederate sympathizer who came from an acting dynasty, who resided on a plantation in the Confederate border state of Maryland that owned many slaves. By today's standards, Wilkes Booth would be a staunch segregationist. On the 14th of April, 1865, Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater and shot the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, in the back of the head with his Derringer pistol. A struggle would soon ensue with Union General Rathbone, who ended up getting stabbed in the process. Wilkes Booth eventually jumped over the railings of the presidential box and down onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process, where he would yell out, "Sic semper tyrannis," which translates to "death to tyrants." He then bolted for the back door, mounting his horse that was already waiting for him, and off he rode across the Potomac River into the former Confederate heartland of Virginia, and then onto the Confederate border state of neighboring Maryland. The federal government, with the assistance of the Union Army and Secret Service, would end up pursuing Wilkes Booth for a total of 12 days. Whilst in Maryland, an injured Booth, who was suffering from a broken leg, came upon the home of a Dr. Samuel Mudd, who he took him in and cared for him, completely unaware of who he was and what he had just done. Booth's standoff with the government eventually came to an end when the Union Army managed to track him down to a tobacco barn located on the property of a Port Royal, Virginia farmer. Booth and his co-conspirator, David Herold, were sleeping in the barn when they were awoken by a division of the Union Army who had surrounded the building. Herold surrendered, but Wilkes Booth vowed to fight on. A Union soldier by the name of Boston Corbett is believed to have discharged a fatal shot into Wilkes Booth, which passed through his neck. The assassin of the 16th president's final words were, "Useless, useless," before passing away from his injuries. Following Wilkes Booth's death, A trial was held in Washington, D.C. for his co-conspirators, which would go on to last a period of 7 weeks. The implicated were the following: Mary Surratt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, George Acerot, and Dr. Samuel Mudd. Upon conclusion of the trial, which by today's standards would be fit for pay-per-view television, all of the implicated co-conspirators were sentenced to hang before a crowd of onlookers at the Washington, D.C. City Jail. That just about concludes today's video. Thank you for watching, and please be sure to subscribe. It's much appreciated. This has been yours truly, Benny9400. See you again soon.